Today, we will learn and reflect on Italy and the dance between the dictator Mussolini and his fascist regime and Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII and the Catholic Church. Although Mussolini's regime was a brutal regime, guilty of murdering its political opponents in broad daylight, the Pope embraced Mussolini and his fascists as friends of the Church. For many years, the Catholic Church prospered under Mussolini. The Church signed a Concordat, the Lateran Treaty, in 1927. This settled the disputes between the Catholic Church and Italy at the time, creating the Vatican City, and the Catholic Church was welcome in the schools and public life of Italy. But the Concordat the Pope later signed with Hitler did not go so well. And in 1938, falling under the spell of Hitler, Mussolini started persecuting the Jews of Italy. So the Pope and the Catholic Church learned the hard way that the Church may be friends with dictators in the short run, but in the long run, the Church is safer living under a democracy, even sometimes when democracies do not pass laws that totally meet the moral approval of the Church. At the end of our talk, we will discuss the main source we used for this video, David Kurtzer's book on the Pope and Mussolini, and my blogs that cover the topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comment. Let us learn and reflect together. Although all fascist regimes were far right-wing, conservative, nationalist, totalitarian regimes, fascism is expressed differently depending on the country. In fascist Italy, Vichy France, and Francoist Spain, the fascist regime actively supported the Catholic Church, where the more extreme Nazi fascism in Germany actively persecuted both Catholics and Protestants after a very brief honeymoon. If you want to distinguish between mainline fascists from the more brutal Nazis, you could say that the Nazis were extremely anti-Semitic and racist first, and totalitarian nationalists second, while fascists were totalitarian nationalists first, and became racist only after they fell under Hitler's thumb. In contrast, Franco was never under Hitler's thumb, and he discreetly offered refuge to the Jews who made it to Spain during World War II. The Catholics of Italy were more fortunate than the Christians of Germany during the dark days of fascism and Nazism. Although Mussolini's totalitarian regime was brutal, and although Mussolini was not a practicing Catholic himself, he did cooperate with the Pope and the Catholic Church. Mussolini did not enact Nazi-style anti-Semitic race laws until he fell under the spell of Hitler after 1938. Until then, the Catholics in the pews were not morally forced to choose between obeying the Church and the state. Mussolini's regime was the first to label itself as fascist, borrowing from the symbolism of the ancient Roman Empire. In Italian, fascio means a bundle of sticks. Individual sticks are easily breakable, but when you bind up a bundle in a regime, together they cannot break, symbolizing the strength of a totalitarian state. We mostly remember the Hitler who conquered much of Europe. Most people do not realize that originally Hitler was inspired in his rise to power by Mussolini's example, and that Mussolini had been El Duce in Italy for over a decade when, inspired by his example, Hitler became the Führer in Germany. Although Italy, like all of Europe, had anti-Semitism embedded into its culture, early fascists were not virulent anti-Semites, and some early fascists were actually Jews. Before we talk about how Mussolini rose to power, we first need to review the historical backstory. And we'll start our backstory with the French Revolution, which had sowed the seeds of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution combined their revolutionary fervor with anti-clerical sentiments, seizing all church properties and requiring priests to swear allegiance to the revolutionary regime. Many priests refused, and they were either executed or exiled. And this persecution helped fuel civil wars, which combined with the general wars against the monarchies of Europe. The revolutionary French eventually won these wars. The French armies recruited widely and fielded passionate citizen armies that overwhelmed the mostly mercenary armies of the monarchs. Also, the French army promoted from within talented generals based on merit rather than birth and class. The The most talented French revolutionary general, Napoleon, in time staged a coup and became Emperor of France and conquered all of Europe, spreading revolutionary ideas as they conquered. Many doubted whether the papacy and Catholicism could survive these troubled times. Napoleon was a revolutionary and Napoleon was no Catholic. But Napoleon was far more interested in being Emperor of Europe. He saw the conflict of the church as a distraction, as many conservative peasants would rather die than renounce their Catholicism. So, Napoleon dictated the terms of the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII. This would presage the Concordat Mussolini would sign with Pope Pius XI in the Lateran Treaty of 1927. In both Concordats, the Catholic Church negotiated from a position of weakness. Napoleon recognized that Catholicism was the religion of most French, but preserved the religious freedoms of Protestants. As was the practice already, Napoleon could nominate bishops, but the Pope could depose them. Most importantly, the Church gave up claims to lands confiscated after 1790, and the state paid the salaries of the clergymen. Napoleon restored Sunday as a day of rest, and restored the church calendar, but the state still kept the church on a short leash in many ways. We see a striking contrast in this painting of the coronation of Napoleon. In the coronation of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor many centuries ago, the Pope had crowned the emperor, but in the coronation of Napoleon, Napoleon seized the crown from the Pope and crowned himself, a very telling symbolism. Like Hitler, Napoleon was undone by his invasion of Russia, failing to appreciate the sheer vastness of the Russian steppes, and also not appreciating the brutal cold of the Russian winter. Both Napoleon and Hitler lost the bulk of their vast armies in Russia. Both sacrificed the momentum of war to their enemies until they were utterly defeated. Now, after Napoleon was defeated, the conservative diplomat Metternich tried to put the revolutionary genies back in their bottles, restoring monarchies across Europe. But the revolutionary ideas kept percolating, resulting in several insurrections in Italy. The Italian revolutionaries dreamed of a united, independent Italy, and revolution spread across all of Europe and across Italy in 1848. There were a series of 3 Italian wars of independence that eventually coalesced around the armies of King Emmanuel II of Sardinia, battling the Austrian armies, the Papal armies, and the armies of other city-states of Italy. And also France and Prussia influenced the events in Italy. Rome was the last papal state to fall in the reunification of Italy, but the popes did not readily acquiesce in the loss of the papal states that had helped protect them somewhat and provide a tax base for the papacy for over a millennium. The Pope refused to cooperate with the new unified Italian government, and it forbade Italian Catholics from serving in the government, and popes would pose as prisoners of the Vatican for the next 50 years, complaining continuously. The army of the Papal States, headed by the Pope, prevented the capture of Rome by the Italian unification forces led by the revolutionary Garibaldi. But in 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, France had to withdraw its troops, and Rome was captured, which was one of the last steps in the unification of Italy. Mussolini came to power about 50 years later, and in many ways the Italian fascist movement can be considered historically as a continuation of the Italian unification struggle, as Mussolini sought to boost the pride of the new Italian nation, seeing himself as the head of a new Roman Empire. And now we'll discuss how Mussolini rose to power. Like Napoleon, Mussolini was no Catholic. Although his mother was a devout Catholic, his father was a socialist revolutionary. Taking after his father, Mussolini was a dedicated atheist and was quite the bully and womanizer. His mother sent him to a Catholic boarding school, but he was expelled when he stabbed a classmate. But then he calmed down somewhat and graduated from secondary school, but he was fired from his first job as a teacher when he had an affair with a married woman. This would be the first of countless and almost simultaneous affairs throughout his life. Later, when he ascended to power, Mussolini would have many mistresses, and even a main mistress who would recruit other mistresses. Many wondered how he had time to govern while he was dallying with so many mistresses. It's doubtful that Mussolini ever regretted or confessed his sins to a priest in the Catholic sacrament of confession. Now, Mussolini had a steely glare that looked straight through you. As a speaker, he was mesmerizing. Early in his 20s, he became the editor of an influential socialist newspaper. He initially supported his Socialist Party's opposition to World War I, but he became convinced that Italy should enter the war on the side of the Allies. Mussolini served in the trenches just like Hitler, and, like Hitler, he found himself recovering in a hospital when the war ended. After the war, Mussolini was disenchanted with socialism. He started his own fascist newspaper with funding from industrialists who hoped to eventually profit from this connection. His attack on war profiteers, defeatists, incompetent generals, and corrupt politicians helped fire up his base. In these early days, Mussolini attacked the church, calling for the seizure of church property. Politics were violent both in Italy and in Germany in these interwar years. Fascism appealed to the nationalism of disenchanted young veterans who would band together in marauding fascist gangs that terrorized their opponents. Mussolini's fascist bully gangs ran amok, attacking socialists all over the country. In the violence of the 1921 elections, hundreds were killed, hundreds were injured, priests were also beaten, but after the votes were counted, the new Fascist Party and the Conservative parties together won a majority, defeating the Socialists, Communists, and the Catholic Popular Party. And we see in the brief summary of the 1921 general election in Italy, like many key elections in many countries throughout history, this election was a close election. In the interwar years, fascists were the enemy of the godless communists. All Europe was fearful that Lenin's Communist Party would succeed in igniting violent revolutions in Europe. And the Communist Party was certainly trying very hard to do just that. Many Europeans thought that since the fascists were the avowed enemies of godless communism, that they might shield the churches from the communists. So fascists were seen as the least worst choice. Although the Italian fascists did form a close alliance with the Catholic Church, the German fascists harassed and persecuted both the Catholic and Lutheran churches. Later, the Spanish Civil War, fought from 1936 to 1939, degenerated into a brutal and bloody war between the Republican communists and the nationalist fascists under General Franco. This was also a proxy war between Russia on one side and fascist Germany and Italy on the other side. The Allies were more neutral in the conflict. Although both parties were guilty of massacres, the communists brutally murdered thousands of priests, monks, and nuns, whereas the nationalists only massacred those priests that basically got in the way. Mussolini surprised everyone in his first speech in Parliament, and he did not consult with anyone in the Vatican before his speech. Fascism, Mussolini proclaimed, would restore Christian society in Italy. Fascism would build up a Catholic state befitting a Catholic nation. Mussolini wanted the Vatican to see his fascist party as their true protectors. The Catholic Popular Party needed to be swept away to isolate the socialists. The Pope decided to slowly swing his support to Mussolini, who appeared to be on the winning side in Italian politics. Meanwhile, the fascist gangs stepped up their attacks on Catholic priests and Catholic Popular Party members and socialists. The socialists called a national strike demanding that the government put an end to the violence. But the fascists struck harder, burning down union halls and bullying strikers back to work. Mussolini gathered together the heads of the fascist militia. They planned insurrections across the country. A band of 26,000 fascist thugs descended on Rome with old army rifles and bludgeons. The Prime Minister declared a state of emergency to order the army to face down the fascists, but the king surprised them by refusing to sign the order. Italy was a constitutional monarchy under Victor Emmanuel III, grandson to King Victor Emmanuel II. Like the Pope, the king was tiring of the instability the fascist gangs were causing, and he likely felt that it would be easier to co-opt them than to defeat them. Humiliated, the Prime Minister resigned, and the king invited Mussolini to form a government as the new Prime Minister. And Hitler learned a bad lesson, that quite often bullies win. Mussolini was eager to show his new ally, the Pope, how he could make the Catholic Church great again. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini was a more faithful ally to the Church, and he only started to turn on the Church when he fell deeper under Hitler's spell when stormtroopers started marching across Europe. In Italy, crucifixes were hung everywhere. The church privileges would be restored, clerical salaries were raised, the state paid for more church repairs, Catholic chaplains would serve in the military, and it was now against the law to insult a priest or Catholicism. To the delight of the Vatican, Catholicism would be taught in all elementary schools. And to top it all off, Mussolini even remarried his wife in the Catholic Church and baptized their children. But occasionally his fascist thugs would bully and beat up the occasional unfortunate priest. Although Mussolini would never totally suppress his thugs, he would never stage an Italian version of Hitler's Night of the Long Knives, where Nazi thugs murdered many in the opposition. Better to have the occasional thuggery, so Mussolini could continually demonstrate to the Pope that he was the only leader who could control them. Why did the Pope betray the Catholic Popular Party to swing his support to Mussolini? Like all popes of his era, Pope Pius XI distrusted democracy, equating it with socialism and atheism and communism. He learned the lessons of the French Revolution altogether too well. Lenin had declared war on the capitalist West, and his minions had murdered hundreds and thousands of priests. And this would soon be repeated in the upcoming Spanish Civil War. Mussolini and the Pope were natural allies against the socialists and the communists. Neither believed in freedom of speech or freedom of association. When Mussolini declared himself the head of the secular totalitarian state, the Pope would respond that he was the head of the clerical totalitarian state. Meanwhile, in Germany, while all this was happening, an obscure former army corporal named Adolf Hitler, inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, adapted the fascist straight-arm salute, tried his own beer hall putsch, but his rebellion was suppressed. Hitler was successfully prosecuted, although he was allowed the publicity of a fiery courtroom speech. In jail, Hitler would write Mein Kampf, the Nazi Bible, which accurately predicted what all his future actions would be, except that nobody would believe him, except for Winston Churchill. But Mussolini would soon have blood on his hands. Mussolini would soon face the first serious challenge as Prime Minister of Italy. A very brave socialist delegate named Giacomo Matteotti strode to the podium on the third day of Parliament while being threatened by fascist thugs, also elected to Parliament. There he bravely announced that the recent election, marred by violence, should be annulled. Mussolini was furious. He turned to Cesare Rossi, his press secretary and head of a secret squad of thugs, and muttered, "That man shouldn't be allowed to remain in circulation." This wasn't a direct order, but we know how mafia bosses work. The boss complains and everybody knows what to do. The next day, 3 thugs, one with brass knuckles, abducted Matteotti in broad daylight in downtown Rome and drove around Rome with the horn constantly blaring so they could drown out the screams of Matteotti while they brutally beat him to death. After his wife calls the police, they find his corpse in a shallow grave. Now, Italy was not yet a totalitarian police state. Many witnesses stepped forward to tell their story of this brazen murder. Everyone knew that the trail led directly to Mussolini. Conservative newspapers turned against him, demanding justice. Many tore up their fascist party cards. Fascists became afraid to march in public. Mussolini hesitated. But not Pope Pius XI. The Pope did not hesitate. He went all out in defending Mussolini. The Pope directed the Vatican newspaper to write an editorial urging all good Catholics to obey civil authorities, and to refuse to cooperate with socialists, and to abstain from violent protest or any sort of protest at all against the government. Mussolini was praised for all he had done for the Church, implying that he did not have anything to do with the murder. Mussolini was so grateful that he enrolled his children in religious lessons, and they would soon celebrate their confirmation and First Communion. But there were now rumors of a possible military coup overthrowing Mussolini with the king's blessing. So, Mussolini had to act. 7 months after the murder of Matteotti, Mussolini decided to speak to Parliament about the issue. And he says this: I declare here in front of the assembly and all the Italian people that I alone assume full political, moral, and historical responsibility for everything that has happened. And the fascist deputy shouted it out: we are all with you. And Mussolini continues: if fascism has been a criminal organization, then I am the head of this criminal organization. And the fascist deputies once again shouted, we are all with you. The applause kept building. Then Mussolini shouted, you believe fascism was finished, but you will see. Italy wants peace. Italy wants tranquility. Italy wants calm. We will give Italy her tranquility. This calm through love if possible, and with force if necessary. Were these rants seen at the time as the rants of a good Catholic? Did the Pope regret his show of support? Now that Mussolini knew that he could get away with murder, literally, he would turn Italy into a dictatorship, subject only to a compliant king. Fascist thugs threw the opposition leaders in jail and closed down their newspapers. New laws were passed banning opposition parties. Only fascist unions were allowed. Strikes were banned. Mayors would be appointed by the central government. The press was censored, and capital punishment was reinstated. And for good measure, Mussolini even tricked his wife into being baptized to please the Pope. And in return for his support for Mussolini, Mussolini delivers the Lateran Accords, the Concordat he so desired. Negotiations for a new Concordat were proceeding while the consequences of the murder of Mattiati were unraveling. These negotiations had been tough. They lasted over 4 years. The biggest roadblock was the Pope's devotion and protection of the national youth group, Catholic Action. The totalitarian fascist government was uncomfortable allowing any national group that might compete with the newly organized Fascist Youth Association. The Pope was reluctant to restrict the Catholic Action groups to prayer and religious instruction. Their recreational activities were what appealed to their youth. Mussolini eventually compromised, except for the occasional fascist gang bullying a Catholic Action group here and there. The Lateran Accords were signed in early 1929. The papacy would receive a generous indemnity for the loss of the Papal States, but the Pope was now recognized as the sovereign ruler over the small 109-acre Vatican territory that contained St. Peter's Basilica. In addition, the Holy See would have special rights to all of Rome's basilicas and the Papal Summer Palace. Rome would guard the Vatican's character as the center of Catholicism and would recognize many Catholic feast days as public holidays. Catholic education would be extended to secondary schools, and all Catholic Action youth groups could operate freely. Later, Mussolini forced the Pope to restrict their activities to the religious sphere, however. Unlike the later Concordat with Hitler, Mussolini would largely respect the terms of the Lateran Accords, and they remain in effect to this day. The Pope was no longer the prisoner of the Vatican. Fascist militia units with their flags and banners celebrated with the faithful in St. Peter's Square. The American Charge d'Affaires in Rome reported that this was a triumph for Mussolini in ending the controversy and in winning over the clergy to fascism. Mussolini and Pope Pius XI were now partners. Mussolini was the secular authoritarian, and the Pope was the clerical authoritarian. Catholics were active in fascist organizations and public schools, while the government supported the church. The government enforced morality laws against racy plays and films and immodestly dressed women. Local Catholic Action groups collaborated with the fascist police. But occasionally fascist bully would still beat up the occasional Catholic priest. As you know, bullies will be bullies. In the heady days following, Mussolini now required that newspapers refer to him as El Duce, with Duce in capital letters. Images of El Duce appeared everywhere in public buildings, offices, and shops. There had to be adoring crowds in all his public appearances, even if that meant dressing up police in civilian clothes to accomplish this. But seeing the growing friendship between Hitler and Mussolini, Pope Pius XI, no doubt, felt that he had a bad feeling about this situation. When we look back in the history of World War II, we can never avert our gaze from the bulging eyes of the skeletal survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, So we naturally ask the question, how could the Pope be so gullible to believe Hitler when he guaranteed the Catholic Church a role in German culture? We forget that the Catholic experience in negotiating with the secular and potential hostile regimes of Napoleon and Mussolini enabled the Catholic Church to survive and even thrive in an increasingly secular world. We can say that when Pope Pius XI and Cardinal Pacelli, who would later succeed him as Pope Pius XII, negotiated the terms of the German Concordat with Hitler, they did not fully realize at the time that Hitler always lied. He always negotiated in bad faith. Hitler never lived up to the terms of the treaty he signed, yet he expected the other party to live up fully to their terms. The compromises the Pope made in agreeing to the German Concordat were similar to the compromises made in the Lateran Treaty, but with much more dire consequences. Just as the Pope had betrayed the Catholic Popular Party in favor of Mussolini's Fascist Party in Italy, the Pope also betrayed the Catholic Center Party, which had the support of the German bishops. Many former Central Party leaders would later be brutally murdered by the Nazis, some in the massacre of the Night of Long Knives. Later, the Nazis would slanderously accuse hundreds of monks and nuns of sexual perversion and accuse Jesuits of financial frauds. The increasing brutality of the Nazi regime worried the Pope, but many of his advisors, including Cardinal Pacelli, urged caution, reminding him that the fascists were the enemies of the real enemy of the Church, communism and Bolshevik Russia. These fears of communism were reinforced by the Spanish Civil War, where Hitler and Mussolini supported the brutal fascist General Franco against the socialists and the communists, who murdered hundreds of priests, monks, and nuns. Every week revealed new brutality in Germany. The Nuremberg laws were passed denying Jews citizenship and forbidding them to marry Aryan Jews. Jews were dismissed from civil service. Catholic parochial schools were harassed in Germany. Chancellor Adolphus of Austria was negotiating an Austrian concordat with the Catholic Church, which was never signed. The wife and children of Adolphus were visiting Mussolini at his summer home, but Chancellor Adolphus was unable to join them. Germany and Austria were to be united in the Anschluss. Mussolini had to tell his wife and children their father would not be joining them, as he had just been murdered by the Nazis. Mussolini urged Hitler to observe the terms of the Concordat in Germany, to discontinue his persecutions of the Jews, but Hitler, of course, would not listen to Mussolini. Mussolini wanted to be a conquering Caesar rebuilding a new Roman Empire, and he decided to start with Ethiopia. Initially, the Pope was reluctant to support the effort that would cause so much suffering among black Ethiopians and Catholic missionaries, but Mussolini pressed on. Initially, the Italians met embarrassing battlefield reverses against stiff Ethiopian resistance, but eventually they triumphed with the use of chemical weapons and bombers and fighter planes. Underwhelming sanctions were applied by the League of Nations, which only served to strengthen ties between Italy and Germany, who both quit the League of Nations. Catholic church bells rung across Italy, celebrating the victory of the Italian forces. But the Pope became increasingly concerned about the growing ties between Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. Pope Pius XI was generally supportive of the milder anti-Semitism early in Mussolini's reign, which was a carryover of the historical anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church had long endorsed. But the increasing brutality of the Nazi policies were too much for Pope Pius XI. His years were advancing, his health was declining, and the Pope was now worried about the status of his everlasting soul. Thus, he felt compelled to speak up against this evil regime. The Pope consulted with Mussolini, who told him he had very little influence over the Fuhrer on matters of religion. The German bishops asked the Pope to prepare an encyclical to urge Nazi officials to respect the terms of the 1933 German Concordat. Copies of this encyclical were smuggled into Germany and was read from the pulpits on Palm Sunday 1937 to surprise congregations totally unused to hearing criticisms of the Nazi regime. And we quote from the Pope's encyclical, "With deep anxiety. While the Catholic Church had entered into the Concordat in good faith," said the Pope, anyone must acknowledge, not with surprise and reprobation, how the other contracting party, aka Nazis, emasculated the terms of the treaty, distorted its meaning, and eventually considered these violations as normal policy. The Pope lamented the destruction of Catholic parochial schools and the breaking of the terms of the Concordat. The Pope castigated those who idolized race and nation, deeming them guilty of distorting and perverting an order of the world planned and created by God. The Pope warned against blending Christianity and race worship. None but superficial minds could stumble into concepts of a national God, a national religion, or attempt to lock with the frontiers of a single people within the narrow limits of a single race, God, the creator of the universe. Though he never mentioned Nazism by name, the Pope thanked those priests and lay people who have persisted in their Christian duty and in the defense of God's right in the teeth of an aggressive paganism. Hitler was furious, first by the unexpected criticism of the encyclical, second by how his message was delivered to all those churches without his prior knowledge. Hitler ordered police to shut down Catholic publishing houses all across Germany. Mussolini urged moderation towards the church. Some speculated the Pope might even excommunicate Hitler. But Hitler and Mussolini were still friends. Mussolini would enjoy a state visit to Berlin where millions of Germans cheered the two dictators. Soon after that, Hitler visited a Rome festooned with swastikas where hundreds of thousands of Italians cheered the two dictators. And Mussolini enacted the first of the Italian race laws against the Jews. The Pope quickly raised the issue that those Catholics who converted from Judaism should not be considered Jews. But now negotiating with Mussolini was more like negotiating with Hitler. The Church agreed not to criticize the regime's new anti-Semitic policies if Mussolini would leave the Catholic action groups alone. When you deal with the Dark Lords of Mordor, you always darken your soul. Catholicism never appealed to Mussolini. He was never a practicing Catholic. He was increasingly drawn into the dark abyss of Nazi ideology. Racial laws were passed in Italy revoking Jewish citizenship, exiling Jews, firing Jewish teachers, expelling Jewish students, expelling Jews from the Fascist Party. Jews could no longer own large businesses or work in professional occupations. Jews were Jews by blood, not religion, just like in Germany. David Kurtzer wrote, after 16 years of nurturing his partnership with the Vatican, Mussolini was allowing his megalomania, his infatuation with Hitler's Third Reich, and his sense of invincibility to get in the way of political judgment. The Pope felt poorly used. Increasingly frail, he knew his own death could not be far off. Pope Pius XI's dream of an Italian confessional state under the terms of the Concordat was instead descending into a nightmare of increasing fascist and Nazi brutality. The 10th anniversary of the Lateran Accords were approaching. The Pope had made known his displeasure of recent brutalities, and Mussolini was reluctant to attend a celebration where the Pope might criticize the regime, which was a very valid fear on Mussolini's part. The Pope had asked that a papal encyclical be drafted condemning racism and the persecution of the Jews. His anticipation of giving a last speech to the many bishops expected to attend the celebrations helped keep him alive. But the day before he planned to give his final speech condemning fascism, Pope Pius XI died. On March 12, 1939, Cardinal Pacelli, the nuncio to Nazi Germany, was crowned Pope Pius XII. In one of his first acts of Pope, Pope Pius XII seized the encyclical and all copies of the troublesome speech, and they would be buried unseen in the Vatican archives for over 50 years. He shared the concerns of his predecessor regarding the racial brutalities and the coming war, but he was ever the diplomat, always mindful that Axis troops could march into the Vatican without opposition at any time. In October, the new Pope Pius XII issued a more diplomatic version as his first encyclical, which celebrated the unity of mankind and cultural diversity and rejected totalitarianism. Pope Pius XII reigned as Pope long after the war ended, passing away in 1958. We've also included on the slides of the timelines of the rules of Mussolini and the two popes of World War II, the reign of Pope John XXIII, because he was the Pope who called the Second Vatican Council into session. And we put him on the slide because the Catholic experience in World War II and in Italy in particular under both Nazism and fascism profoundly changed Catholic thinking and attitudes. And we look at outside events. The long, bloody war that all Europe expected finally commenced. In September 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, imprisoning and murdering many Polish Catholic priests. And in the spring of 1940, Mussolini gleefully joined with Hitler in their invasions of France and all of Europe. After a month of invading France in World War I, the Germans got bogged down in trench warfare about 40 miles from Paris. But in World War II, the Nazis blitzkrieged to Paris in 2 weeks. The Italians were peasants. They were not born soldiers. Poorly equipped, poorly led, and poorly trained. Later on in the World War II, the German army had to rescue the Italians when they got bogged down when they invaded Greece. And later in the war, in November 1942, the Allies invade French North Africa in Operation Torch. There were multiple landings in French Morocco and Algeria, and the better equipped Allied armies defeated the German and Italian armies in Africa, which was followed in the next year, 1943, with the invasion of Sicily, and then the Allied invasion of the boot of Italy. As the Allies bombed Rome, the Grand Council of Fascism deposed Mussolini, and the king had Mussolini arrested. King Emmanuel III of Italy may have been happy with the modest military success of Mussolini before this terribly destructive war started, and before Mussolini's more modest fascism morphed into the more cruel ideology of Nazism after Mussolini fell under the spell of Hitler. But being Emperor of Ethiopia and Albania was not worth the suffering caused when the Allied armies were posed to invade the boot of Italy. The king quickly signed an armistice with the Allies, but that meant that 2 days later Nazi troops invaded and occupied Rome. While the Nazis started deporting the Italian Jews to the death camps, thousands of Italian Jews fled, many hiding in the monasteries and convents of the Vatican. And as a side story, there's a very interesting video on the rescue of Mussolini. Nazi troops under the famed Otto Skorzeny rescued Mussolini from the mountaintop chalet and flew him into Germany. And you could see that the Italians did not fight so very hard, as we have a rather tourist-like picture with the Italian troops and the German troops and Mussolini before he departed. Hitler then named Mussolini as the leader of a short-lived rump puppet state in northern Italy. Mussolini did not have much to do as the puppet ruler of the rump fascist Italian state, since the Nazis were making all of the decisions now. Near the end of the war, Mussolini attempted to flee, but he was captured and murdered by Italian partisans. And the corpses of Mussolini, his mistress, and his other companions were hung by their heels outside the same gas station where the fascists had earlier murdered and hung the corpses of partisans sometime before. And as a historical side note, you can see in the picture that a peasant woman pinned the skirts of Mussolini's mistress to protect the modesty of her corpse. At war's end, King Emmanuel III abdicated to his son Umberto, but the new Italian Republic abolished the monarchy. Pope Pius XII survived the war with his reputation intact. There are many who today argue he could have done far more to protest the Holocaust. But if he had been more vocal, perhaps fascists and Nazi troops would have marched in and murdered everyone in the Vatican. Hitler had been planning to murder the Pope anyway once he won the war in Europe. His successor, Pope John XXIII, opened the windows of the Catholic Church to the modern world by calling the Second Vatican Council. The experiences of the Catholic Church in Germany and in Italy and in France influenced the decrees of the Council. In particular, its decree on religious freedom, which extolled the virtues of democracy. After her experiences under the fascist Mussolini and the Nazi Hitler and the fascist Vichy regime in France, the Catholic Church no longer trusted totalitarian regimes, even when they seemed to be friends of the Church. And now we'd like to discuss the sources we used in this video. David Kurtzer's book, The Pope and Mussolini, is a joy to read, and he's a balanced observer, acting neither as an apologist or as a scathing critic of the Catholic Church. The popes during the war years were walking a tightrope. They needed to push back against the evils of Hitler, but if they pushed back too hard, then the Catholics would be persecuted that much more vigorously. This book was written after the Vatican opened the archives for Pope Pius XI. In response to public pressure, some years ago, the Vatican released many documents regarding the official acts of Pope Pius XII regarding the Holocaust and relations with Germany, and our author used these sources and the documents found in the German archives. Pope Francis opened the remaining archives of Pope Pius XII in March 2020, but then a week later closed them because of COVID, and the Papal Library was not reopened until June 2020 under restricted admission. So far, we haven't heard any bombshell revelations in the media, so we can reaffirm that the relationship between Mussolini and the two popes were, as you could say, complicated, as relationships sometimes tend to be. David Kurtzer did report in an interesting story in the Atlantic magazine that likely affected how the decrees of Vatican II regarding the Jewish religion were drafted. This was known as the Finley Affair. The parents of two Jewish French Finley boys were sent to the death camps, and a devout Catholic woman agreed to raise them, and she did what all devout Catholics would do. She baptized them. And after the war, the aunt of the two boys thanked this woman for her kindness and asked that they be turned over to her, their nearest living relative. But it was Catholic canon law at the time that once a child was baptized, they should stay Catholic. And the church stated that the boys would only be released to their relatives if they guaranteed that their Catholic religious education would be continued. The French courts ordered that the children be returned to their parents, but the Catholic lady refused. And some monks and nuns got involved and arranged to move the boys to a monastery near the Spanish border. And the boys were soon smuggled across the border to a monastery in Spain. Now, what the opening of the Vatican archives revealed was that Pope Pius XII was aware of the situation. Like the Dreyfus affair we discussed in our video on Vichy France, this got into the newspaper and caused quite a ruckus in the papers. After appeal and appeal and appeal, and after some years, the French courts actually threw our devout laity and some guilty monks and nuns in prison for kidnapping. And the Vatican ordered the Spanish clerics to return the boys to their relatives, but they dilly-dallied. Much of the correspondence regarding this case also includes numerous anti-Semitic slurs. The Vatican, tiring of the bad press, worried that the French government would pass legislation that was not friendly to the Church. So the Pope and high Vatican officials insisted that the boys be released to their relatives with no qualifications, and the boys eventually immigrated to Israel, and they resumed their life as Jews. The Vatican official handling this case was the future Pope Paul VI, who wrapped up the Second Vatican Council after Pope John XXIII had died. Our beloved author, David Kurtzer, believes that his experience with handling the case of the Finley boys influenced the attitudes of our future Pope and helped ensure that the Vatican II Council would enact the decree declaring that the Jewish religion should be respected, that Jews can be saved without being baptized. Under current canon law, the Finley boys would likely have been returned to their relatives. So we may see a new edition of this book released sometime in the future, since we know that the author is rummaging through the archives of Pope Pius XII. Now, one disturbing topic not discussed in the book was the story of how high officials in the Vatican were involved in the rat line smuggling Nazis out of Europe into friendly Latin American pro-German governments. And this is the first of several entering videos by Mark Felton on the rat lines that helped the former Nazis flee to Argentina and other countries in Latin America after the end of World War II. And we challenge our listeners to sample our videos on civil rights so you can be more compassionate towards the plight of our black brothers in Christ. Frederick Douglass belongs to the first generation of black leaders. He escapes from slavery and became a leading abolitionist orator before the Civil War and was a leading civil rights leader during the Reconstruction years after the Civil War. Booker T. Washington was the next generation of black leaders. He was a teenager when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the Deep South. And Booker T. Washington was both an orator and a second-generation black leader who focused on educating the freed slaves so they could improve themselves. And W.E.B. Du Bois was the third generation of black leaders. He was born during Reconstruction. He was an orator, writer, and a third-generation activist black leader who helped found the NAACP. And also we have a video on Father Tolton, who, like Booker T. Washington, was emancipated during the Civil War. He was invited to study in Rome for the priesthood and was the first former slave who was ordained a priest, in spite of the fact that at the time that he was emancipated, he was illiterate. The YouTube description links to the video script in our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends, and by clicking the like and subscribe button, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, and please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos and other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.